Washington Journal continues.
Our guest is the executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, Dalia Mogahed, here to talk about a new poll specifically looking at Muslims and Islam. Why is that?
I think that this is an important topic for several reasons, one of which is the president has made it a priority to reach out to Muslim communities around the world. So at the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, we actually focus on this topic, and we felt that it was important a year into office to look at how Americans perceive Muslims and Islam.
And so when you talk to those who you polled, what kind of questions do you ask them, and what was the end result of what you found out?
We asked the American public, so as a representative sample of American households, what their opinions of several religious groups, not just Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, as well as Christians. And we asked them if they knew a member of that religious group, their opinion of the religion itself, Islam, Christianity, and so forth. And then we asked them to tell us, if they were really honest with themselves, how much prejudice, if any, do they have toward each of the religious groups that we discussed. We also looked at a focus on Muslims in general, and what were people's opinions about them as a group. So how do Americans feel about Muslims and gender equality, tolerance of other faiths, accepting people who are different from them, and so forth.
And what was the difference between how people, or at least Americans, perceive Muslims and how they perceive Islam?
It's a really interesting question. We found that Americans felt more positively about Muslims than they did about Islam as a faith. So the majority of Americans express negative views of Islam as a faith, whereas the majority, about 53%, say that they don't have prejudice toward Muslims. So Islam fares a bit worse than Muslims as a group.
And as far as looking specifically at Islam as a faith, how did those who answered that way come to their conclusions?
Well, that's an interesting question. We didn't look directly at how people who came to that conclusion, how did they get there. What we did look at is those who express prejudice toward Muslims. It's about 9% say they have a great deal of prejudice. What was behind that? We did what's called an odds ratio analysis, where we look at what factors make people more likely to fall into that group. We also did the same analysis to look at what factors made people more likely to say they have no prejudice against Muslims.
So as far as the factors, what did you find out from there?
We found that the factor that is most strongly associated with anti-Muslim prejudice was for someone to express anti-Jewish prejudice. So all else being equal, demographics, education, and so forth, a factor that comes out as strongest is someone who has anti-Jewish sentiment is much more likely to also have anti-Muslim sentiment, and that came out as the strongest variable.
And was there any explanation of why that is?
Well, it's of course up to analysts and intellectuals to think about what could have caused that connection. What we found is that there was a strong link between anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim sentiment, and there are several reasons why that could be.
As far as the perception of anti-Muslim sentiment, perception being one thing, ultimately, are you concerned that the perception turns into actions at some point? Is that some of the reasoning of why you take these polls?
Well, there's of course possibilities of perception does lead in some ways to behavior. What we're really looking at is an understanding of what's behind perceptions, how many people have certain perceptions, how do they change over time, and then we're also attempting to get at the question of why. Why do people have the perceptions they do? It's really to give leaders the information they need to make better decisions. That's what Gallup has been doing for 70 years.
Is it fair to say that the perceptions are formed when they hear of acts of, say, Muslim extremism in other countries, or in some cases this country?
It's entirely possible. We also looked at media content analysis done by another firm called Media Tenor, which found that even as far back as 2007, that Islam receives the highest volume of media coverage of any religion, and at the same time also has the most negative coverage. And so there's this steady stream of negative coverage when it comes to Islam. And so even though many Americans don't know a Buddhist, for example, and don't know much about Buddhism, very few have prejudice against Buddhism. So Americans, in general, naturally are not prone to prejudice. If they don't know someone, they're actually prone to not have prejudice. Prejudice really has to be taught, something that has to be learned.
Now, you said media, but what's defined as negative coverage?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's an entire methodology and code that Media Tenor looks at, and they actually look at negative statements made when a reporter is covering a story about Islam.
Such as?
Saying that, say, for example, an act of violence was done because of the faith, or something linking the faith to something negative. They also look at neutral as well as positive coverage, and found that the majority is negative. Whereas when they looked at coverage of Christianity as a faith, the majority of the coverage was neutral. They also found that protagonists representing each faith were quite different. So the majority of people representing Islam in the media, or in news coverage rather, are militants. So our militants are being portrayed as religious actors, whereas when it comes to Christianity, it's religious leaders. They are the ones representing Christianity as a faith.
How many people were sampled in this poll?
1,000, that's the industry standard.
And is it available on the website then?
Yes, if you go to Gallup.com or MuslimWestFacts.com, you can download the full report.
And our guest is here to talk about her findings and talk with you as well. And there are several ways that you can do that this morning. If you want to call in, 3 lines, 202-737-0002 for Democrats, 202-737-0001 for Republicans, 202-628-0205 for Independents, and journal@cspan.org is our email. And if you follow us on Twitter, that's twitter.com/cspanwj. You talked about the president's role in reaching out to Muslims. How has he done 1 year in? Initially, from the initial speeches that he made.
Well, we found that there's actually been an improvement across especially Arab countries when it comes to approval of U.S. leadership. We took a poll shortly before the Cairo speech and then one after, and we actually found that in many countries there was a 10 to 15 point improvement in the approval among people of U.S. leadership. So there has been, the trend is toward improvement of the opinion of the United States among Muslims.
When was this poll taken?
This poll was taken in late October, early November. It was a 3-week field period.
So before the events of December, so the reason being, I was wondering if it was to be swayed by the December events.
It was before December, the December events, but it did span the Fort Hood attack. So that was actually included in the fielding period.
Did people bring that up?
They didn't directly bring it up because the questions were closed-ended, so we didn't ask them to, tell us in an open-ended way what they thought. But it's important to note that when you look at the media content analysis of the past year or even year and a half, there is a steady pattern of negative coverage. So Fort Hood would have been, of course, an issue, but it's not as if there was nothing going on before that.
Dalia Mogahed is our guest for this segment. And again, the lines will be on your screen as well as our other addresses. Our first call is on our independent line. Tim from Lake Jackson, Texas. Good morning. Go ahead.
Thank you for taking my call, ma'am. I'd just like to say that the problem we have with the polling in America is people are so ignorant because they don't know that we're fighting all these wars for Israel and we get attacked because we support Israel. You can see what motivated 9/11 hijackers at neoconzionistthreat.com.
Caller, you have a question specifically for our guest and specifically for our poll because you put a lot of them.
9/11 hijackers at neoconzionistthreat.com.
We'll leave it there. Lewiston, Wyoming. Democrats line. Eric, go ahead.
Yes, I'm prejudiced. I'm prejudiced against all organized religions. To me, to have one mindset, everybody walks into a building and you're brainwashed into this belief, especially with you wearing that scarf around your neck, your head.
I'll keep it there, caller. We invite our guests to be with us, and we'd like to ask all of us, despite your position, refrain from making personal attacks against our guests. That said, for those taking the poll, part of it dealt with people who define themselves as a member of an organized religion and how they perceive not only many types of other religions, but specifically Muslims and Islam. So what were the findings?
Interestingly, we found that church attendance, frequent church attendance, was associated with less prejudice. So people who say they go to church more than once a week were half as likely to say they have extreme prejudice toward Muslims. And people who say that same group were more likely to say they had no prejudice. So it is interesting. The last caller who said he had prejudice against all organized religions, that was actually a segment we discovered in the data. There is a group of people who simply have prejudice against all organized, literally, they have prejudice against all Jews, all Muslims, and all Christians because they think religion, and if you look at their demographics, they self-identify as atheists. They think religion in general is objectionable. So I think that the data does challenge a lot of perhaps conventional wisdom about what leads or what is associated with prejudice.
One of the charts here, according to the questions I guess you asked, do you yourself happen to know anyone in the following religious groups or not? When it says Buddhist, 32% defines as some said that yes, they know someone. 99% of those who responded said they knew someone in the Christian faith. 81% said they knew someone in the Jewish faith. And 52% said they knew someone in the Muslim faith. Does that number surprise you at all, the 52%?
The number is actually quite high. In past polls, that number was smaller than a majority. So it appears that people are more aware maybe of the Muslims they do know. Maybe they didn't know their doctor was a Muslim or their dentist or whatever. Or that Muslims are being more proactive in getting out and getting to know people. I think what was interesting about that data was that knowing a Muslim, just simply knowing a Muslim, was not significantly associated with having no prejudice. However, if you didn't know a Muslim, that actually made someone more likely to have extreme prejudice. So what that really means is knowing a Muslim is associated with softening extreme prejudice, but isn't enough to eliminate it altogether.
Kansas City, Missouri. Tony on our Republican line.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. This is not a question of people being prejudiced against Islam. I've lived with Muslims all my life. I came from Nigeria. But Muslims are very intolerant of other religions. Look at what is happening in Nigeria now. They are killing Christians in their area. So don't say people are prejudiced against Muslims. All over the world, they are the cause of all problems. And that's all I have to say.
Ms. Mogahed.
I think the caller is making a point that I've actually gotten in emails and some feedback on the poll. It's important to understand how we define prejudice, and it's completely self-reported. So we're not attempting to judge whether or not someone is prejudiced based on their views of Muslims in any other way other than for them to simply tell us that they are prejudiced. So that's an important point to make. This is completely self-reported, and people may very well, and some people in our poll have negative views of Muslims, such as the ones expressed by the caller, that Muslims are intolerant, for example, or perceived to be intolerant and unaccepting of other faiths, and at the same time tell us they have no prejudice whatsoever, and we will accept that as being no prejudice. It's interesting to note, though, that when we look at Muslim public opinion, we've actually asked them about their opinions of other faiths. So that was a question I think some people had, well, how do Muslims feel about Christians? And the answer is actually, maybe to the surprise of many, very positively. For example, in Jordan, vast majority say they have favorable opinions of Christians. In Lebanon, Muslim Lebanese, 90% of them say they have positive opinions of Christians despite the civil war that was fought along religious lines, roughly. So Christianity or Christians is actually viewed rather positively by most Muslims. What they express unfavorable opinion about is the United States, and specifically the United States government, not the religion of Christianity. Well, when you look at the data, it's associated mostly with their perception of our policies, not our culture, principles, or religion.
Washington, D.C. on our independent line. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. I've called many times to NPR, and the reason I'm going to focus on NPR's coverage of a few stories is just to highlight how hate is manufactured, and it's not something we're born with. And for example, like the gentleman that just called about Nigeria, he was told that Muslims were rioting, but he wasn't told that from the 500 killed, 480 were Muslim, that the people were butchering Muslims over there and the victims were Muslim. But to manufacture hate, the American media would say that, yes, the Muslims rioted and 500 killed, leaving out the fact that it was Muslims being butchered, and nobody held accountable for butchering them in Nigeria. Also, like, for example, the other place, and I call NPR, and I've spoken to Alicia Shepard, who's responsible for the truth in NPR, and she's just basically almost ignored everything I said. But anyways, another issue about Yemen, and I called them also, and I told them, listen, 6 months ago there was a national alliance against the Yemenis dictator, who is a dictator. I said tens of thousands of troops, Marxists, socialists, Sunnis, all united to say we want to get rid of this guy. It's not anything religious-based. Since then, he's been singing the tune of Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda. He says there's 200 Al-Qaeda. No, there's 20, 30,000 people trying to get you out. They're trying to free themselves of you.
Caller.
And he's using this Al-Qaeda.
Caller, you've made your point. We're not affiliated with NPR, but do you have a specific question for our guest?
Yes, how can we get the American media to say the truth, to highlight the fact that, wait a minute, this is being used, like, for example, one more issue.
No, you made two already, but we'll leave your question stand as it is. Ms. Mogahed.
I think the caller's frustration with the media is shared by several people. There are, of course, pressures on media to make stories interesting, but it is important to look at objective data on media content analysis and to ask, is it really doing the service that it's meant to do, which is to report things in a neutral way. I would like to also pick up on just one other quick thing, which is this idea of the victims of rioting or the victims of terrorism, in fact, being mostly Muslims. So the numbers do pan that out, that the victims of terrorism around the world, the vast majority are Muslims. They are the primary targets. And not only that, but Muslims are also, around the world, according to our research, are more likely than Americans to express concern and fear of being victims of a terrorist attack. So this is an issue that really is shared.
Let me step back 1 second, because you said the way you define prejudice is one of the ways you went into this poll. How is prejudice defined from those you took the information from?
It's defined however they would define it for themselves. So the question was, if you were really honest with yourself, how much prejudice, if any, would you think you have against each of the following religious groups?
Against Muslims, 9% said a great deal, 20% said some, 14% said a little, and then 57% said none at all.
Right.
So the none at all weighed out the other three combined.
That's true.
Was that encouraging to you?
Well, it's certainly encouraging. We're really looking at what are the facts and not having a point of view either way. However, when you look at, compared to other faith groups, it does tend to be significantly higher. So the percentage of people who say that they have no prejudice against Jews, Buddhists, and Christians are similar, and it's well over 57%.
Well, as far as Christians, 4% said they were a great deal, and then more than 80% for Christians, Jews, and Buddhists.
Right.
Next call is Katy, Texas. Terry on our Republican line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. How are y'all?
Fine. Go ahead with your question, sir.
I'd like to make a comment. I have Jewish friends. I'm a Christian. I have Jewish friends. I have a couple of Muslim friends. And I don't believe that anybody should be prejudiced against anybody for any generalization. But what the Muslims don't do in America is like after the bomber came in from Nigeria, the one that went through Yemen. All right, Detroit, the next day, they had 50 Muslims that come out and by the jail there, and they picketed against this type of thing. Well, the Muslims don't come out and say, look, we don't like this no more than you do. And I know they don't, but they need to come out and stand up for themselves more and say, look, we're not for this kind of thing. These people, they don't speak for us. Mm-hmm. I think the Muslims in America need to stand up and make themselves known how they feel. So many people don't go around wondering.
I think the caller's sentiment is one that's shared by many people. I've heard this from almost every audience I've addressed, that people really are demanding that Muslim Americans specifically be louder in their condemnation of the terrorist attacks. Now, it's important to note that all the major national organizations have and continue to issue condemnations of these terrorist attacks. It's also important to note that many of the victims would have been Muslim. People in that plane headed to Detroit, well, you know, Detroit is home to many Muslim Americans. So just like the caller said, this is something that affects everyone. And I think what Muslim Americans have told me, not in a poll, but just anecdotally, is that they feel just as American as everyone else and just as victimized by this terrorism or any attempted terrorist attack as anyone else, and don't feel comfortable that they would have any special duty to condemn it more than anyone else. That people should understand that just like their Christian neighbor and their Jewish neighbor, they should just assume that Muslim Americans are just as against it, without having to do something extra to prove it to people.
How would, here in America, the findings that for those prejudiced against Muslims or Islams, how would that compare to other areas of the world?
It's a really good question. I think that we've done similar research in Germany, in France, and in the UK. And we do find that the United States tends to be less prejudiced than, say, Germany or France. So it's on par with Britain, but less prejudiced or more favorable than France and Germany.
Thibodaux, Louisiana. Democrats line, Janice, go ahead.
Yes, Ms. Mogahed.
Yes,
I started listening a little late, so maybe you've answered this question, or maybe it's not an appropriate question for your poll. But something I'd like to know, what is the philosophical difference between Christianity and Islam?
Well, that's a very deep question that I think would take a while to explore, and I'd encourage you to refer to some websites that would explain the differences. I think it would be outside the scope of this program. Thank you for your question.
Lincoln, Nebraska. Sam on our Republican line.
Good morning. My question really was similar to the previous one, but I would like to add, does Islam recognizes Christianity? And if it does, can you explain? Second, why when there is something bad happen in the world, crime or something happen, if it's a Muslim who does it, always religion is connected with it. But there are thousands of people die in the United States daily from crimes. Nobody refer to them as Christian crimes or other religion crimes. Can you explain that to me, please? Thank you.
I think the caller's question is, does Islam recognize Christianity? And I think it's very easy to say the answer is yes. Islam, Quran does recognize Christians and Christianity, and like I said, the majority of Muslims actually have favorable opinions of Christians. The second piece is around framing. I think the issue of are violent actors being portrayed as religious actors? And that does tend to be the case, according to media content analysis, that there is an issue with how things are framed. Not only is there just more coverage of violent acts, which makes sense because these things are happening and they're newsworthy, but that they are framed as religious acts rather than just simply violent acts.
Our guest is the head of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, Gallup.com, the website, if you want to find out information about this study and read it for yourself. We'll continue on this topic for about 15 more minutes. Staten Island, New York. Heshan, on our independent line.
Good morning, and I would like to thank C-SPAN for having Dalia, because I find the media does not usually bring Muslim guests to explain what our Muslim values or Muslim issues are. So one more thing that I find that people tend to take what they hear at face value. I would like just to mention something for anyone who would like to get information about Islam. It is very widely available. Just pick up a copy of the Quran. Go on the internet and ask for a free copy to be mailed to your house and read it for yourself rather than listening to others who tell you what's in the Quran. And Dalia, what can we do in order to bring more awareness of the real Islam versus what most people hear from media? And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
The caller's question is, I think, very important, because we found that one of the strongest factors associated with no prejudice is, well, first, the strongest one was having a favorable opinion of Jews. So there is this link between the two. But among those is a positive opinion of Islam, or a favorable opinion of the faith, and again, even more important than just simply knowing someone. So I think that from that, if someone were to want to reduce prejudice, one of the most important things that has to happen is for people to have honest dialogue about Islam as a faith and what it teaches, and for the questions, these honest, well-intentioned questions, to be answered authoritatively and accurately by people who have studied the faith.
Islam is the most negatively viewed religion. This is a finding of the poll when asked of their opinions of it. 31% said that when it comes to Islam, they were not favorable towards it. 22% said not too favorable. 33% said somewhat favorable, and then 9% said very favorable, with 5% showing don't know. What else do we learn from these numbers and from what you found out of it?
Well, we learned that there's a lot of work to do for anyone who's interested in fostering better relations or greater understanding between faiths. Because Islam, when so many people have unfavorable opinions of Islam, and it is associated statistically with unfavorable opinions or expressed prejudice toward Muslims. So there is this connection between how people feel about the faith and their own self-reported prejudice against the people as a group. I think that probably would concern many people outside even the Muslim faith.
Millstown, New Jersey is up next on a Republican line. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, good morning, everybody. My question to her is basically very simple, okay? What is more important to her, her religion or the American flag and its rules and laws? Thank you.
You can answer that if you wish.
It's an interesting personal question. I think that it's important to note that Muslim Americans and Muslims actually even in Europe have expressed an equal sense of importance for both their religion and their faith. And so we find in the data that the two are not contradictory or competing identities, but rather complementary identities. So people who identify strongly with their faith actually also identify strongly with their country, America or France or Germany, whatever the country may be. And that we find that there's no correlation between a strong religious identity and a lower or a weaker national identity. The two can be strong at the same time, and indeed they can even strengthen each other.
When it comes to how much knowledge about the following religions, according to the poll, 3% said they had a great deal of knowledge about Islam, 34% had some knowledge, 40% said very little knowledge, and then 23% said none at all. Can you clarify what defines a great deal of knowledge compared to some knowledge in this case?
It's, again, self-reported. However someone would assess their own knowledge. It is interesting to note that we still find the majority of Americans say that they have little to no knowledge about Islam, despite the heavy media coverage and despite the growing engagement between the United States and Muslim-majority societies. I think this is a gap that is important to fill.
Just by comparison, 67% said they had a great deal of knowledge of Christianity, and only 7% said they had knowledge of Judaism. Detroit, Michigan, up next. Darren on our Democrats line.
Yes. I would like to say that it depends on what you say is the personality of the person who has the religion. Wouldn't it depend on the personality of the person who has a religion? A lot of folks forget that Muhammad Ali is a Muslim, and a lot of folks have embraced him. It makes a real big difference in how we look at things. I find Obama really trying to break down a lot of negative stereotypes to embrace all religions and work as people, and those who are positive for our intended, focused goals.
Ms. Mogahed.
I think the caller's point about knowing someone that you regard positively who's a Muslim will help break down stereotypes and bring people together. And the data does tend to support that. Again, not knowing a Muslim at all is associated with makes someone more likely to have extreme prejudice. So, yes, knowing someone personally is associated with more positive views. But again, what is even more important is how someone feels about the faith that unites the group, and it's really there where more of the education needs to happen.
Johnson City, Tennessee, on our Republican line.
Hello.
You're on. Go ahead.
Okay, I have a question for the young lady. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that a while ago you said that the problem that Islam has with the United States is not against the citizens, but against the U.S. government. Am I correct?
Well, yes, let me just clarify. What we find in our data is that what Muslim people around the world say that they have a problem with is U.S. government policies and not its people.
Okay, well, considering America was founded on Christian principles, why should our government and our people embrace Islam, and knowing that Islam is against our Christian values and beliefs? Why should we, knowing that and that is why our media does report that it's Islamic terrorists, because they are the ones trying to kill us. You don't see Christians strapping bombs to them and killing other people, innocent people.
Okay. Well, I think some of the callers' points are important to address because I think they're shared by many people. First of all, just to clarify, I don't think anyone has ever suggested that the U.S. should embrace Islam. That's not something that we hear from Muslim publics, and it's certainly not something that we've discussed here this morning. Now, the issue with the term Islamic terrorism is that it implies several things. First of all, that the terrorists themselves are Islamic, which is exactly what which is exactly what they want us to say about them. They want to claim a moral validity. They want to claim that they are acting in accordance to Islam. The problem is when we give them that kind of credit, we actually bolster their point while alienating the vast majority of Muslims who disagree with them, that we really need as allies, not as enemies. So the term Islamic terrorism actually just fuels the enemies that we're trying to destroy by strengthening their propaganda.
One more call, East Brookfield, Massachusetts. Craig on our independent line.
Good morning.
You're on, sir.
Doing?
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. All right. I would like to know how you would define the infidel in the Muslim religion and how the role of the infidel in the religion will change or as the Muslim religion grows.
Well, the term infidel was not covered in our research in any way, so it's outside the scope of this study, and I think that these are exactly the kinds of questions that need to be dealt with and discussed honestly for there to be progress on this issue.
When you put these polls together, what's your hope as far as the information? What do you want people to do with it?
What we want people to do is be better informed. We want people to make their opinions and their decisions based on facts. And our goal at Gallup is to better inform the public and leaders so that they are making more educated decisions.
Gallup.com is the website where you can find all this information, the poll, and all the statistical information associated with it. It's a hyperlink to our C-SPAN website as well. Dalia Mogahed of Gallup, thank you so much.
My pleasure, thank you.
Coming up, we're going to take a look at the economic freedom of the United States. A new poll that was done by the Heritage Foundation and the Wall Street Journal takes a look at how the United States ranks. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but first we'll take a look at this week's news through political cartoons.
Washington Journal continues.
Our guest is the executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, Dalia Mogahed, here to talk about a new poll specifically looking at Muslims and Islam. Why is that?
I think that this is an important topic for several reasons, one of which is the president has made it a priority to reach out to Muslim communities around the world. So at the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, we actually focus on this topic, and we felt that it was important a year into office to look at how Americans perceive Muslims and Islam.
And so when you talk to those who you polled, what kind of questions do you ask them, and what was the end result of what you found out?
We asked the American public, so as a representative sample of American households, what their opinions of several religious groups, not just Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, as well as Christians. And we asked them if they knew a member of that religious group, their opinion of the religion itself, Islam, Christianity, and so forth. And then we asked them to tell us, if they were really honest with themselves, how much prejudice, if any, do they have toward each of the religious groups that we discussed. We also looked at a focus